evening, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our session this morning that is titled Sunlight in the State Tech. Just how much do we know about government procurement of digital identity and AI in Africa? We're going to have a 1-hour session, and I have 3 very exciting panelists who have joined me this morning. My name is Robert Karanja, and I'm from the Omedia Network. I'm based in Nairobi and work on the responsible technology team and also lead Omedia's work on the African continent. Just a bit of background about Omedia Network. Omedia is a social change venture that aspires to build a global technological ecosystem that reaches and works for everyone. It's one that balances innovation with responsibility, regardless of whether technology is deployed by individuals, companies, or governments. Some of our partners across the continent share the belief that Africa's digital infrastructure and economy can be a force for good, and this is powered by inclusive, interoperable, and trustworthy systems that embrace strong privacy and data protections and that serve the public interest. So I'd like to perhaps just give a brief overview of our session this morning before I invite my panelists to introduce themselves. So, Sunlight in the State Tech. Today, we know very little about procurement of digital technology systems like AI, digital ID, and facial recognition by African governments. What has happened is that this has cut off the channel for civil society to hold governments accountable for some of the risks that may be associated with this digital procurement. So in this session this morning, we're going to discuss findings from a 3 assessment, share a research methodology that can be used in other global South countries, and also seed greater coordination between the open contracting and data privacy movements. So I'm joined by 3 very distinguished panelists this morning, and I'll ask each one of them to introduce themselves. Our first panelist is Nkem Ilo. Nkem is the CEO of the Public and Private Development Center based in Nigeria. Nkem, welcome and kindly introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. My name is Nkem Ilo. I work for the Public and Private Development Center, PPDC in Nigeria, and our work primarily is on public procurement governance and open contracting, access to information, and public participation in a way that improves efficiency and in service delivery. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nkem, and welcome. Next, I'll ask our next panelist, Ruth Bato, who's the program assistant for the Center for Media Studies and Peace Building based in Liberia. Welcome, Ruth.
And thank you, Robert. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ruth Bato. I work at the Center for Media Studies and Peace Building as program assistant. And as a local CSO, we are working to promote freedom of expression. And our primary objective is to work with Liberian journalists and media managers, thereby enhancing a free environment for the media in Liberia to thrive. So we are driven by the passion of media rights and freedom of expression using a multi-stakeholders approach. I'm so pleased to be here this morning.
Thank you very much, Ruth, and welcome. And last but not least, I'll invite Gilbert Sandugwa, Director of the Africa Freedom of Information Center based in Uganda. Welcome, Gilbert.
Thank you, Robert. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Gilbert Sandugwa. I'm the Executive Director of the Africa Freedom of Information Center, which is the largest membership civil society network promoting the right to information, transparency and accountability across the African continent. We have now 46 members in 25 African countries. Very glad to be here. Thank you very much.
Gilbert, thank you very much. And before we get started with our panelists and dive into this session a bit deeper, we would like to invite the participants to participate in a session poll. And if you scroll down if you scroll down on your window, you'll be able to see the session poll at the bottom. Essentially, our poll is going to be responding to 3 different questions. The first question is, does the procurement and deployment of digital technology systems in Africa reflect on principles of transparency and accountability? And you have 4 choices. You can either strongly agree, you can strongly disagree, or you may not know. Our second question in the poll will look at the collection, the management, and the use of personal information that is collected using digital technology systems in Africa. Is this properly regulated and free of abuse and risk? And that statement can either be true, false, or you may not know. The third question that we're going to be looking at in the poll is, do government agencies in Africa use personal information collected using digital technology systems exclusively for the intended purposes? And you could either strongly agree, you could agree, or strongly disagree, or you may not know. So the poll will be open and will be running right through the session. So please feel free to respond to that, and then we'll circle back to some of the responses as we move along with our session. In addition, I'd also welcome all our participants to please use the Q&A window to ask any questions that we can then direct to any of the panelists. So that will be running right through the session, and we'll be picking up the questions that you may have and asking the panelists to respond to them as we move along. So I think we can now get started with our session. And I would like to pose my first question to Gilbert. Gilbert, if you could, in summary, just share with the audience what the study was all about, the study on sunlight in state tech, how you went about it, what were some of the issues that you were addressing, are there some issues of concern, were there similarities across the 3 countries, were there some differences? If you could share that with our audience, that would be greatly appreciated. Over to you, Gilbert. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Technology, and more especially digital technology systems, play an important role in facilitating development and other areas, including safe migration, national security and defense, elections management, and many other spheres of life. Whereas procurement and deployment of digital technology systems, such as biometric, fingerprinting, facial recognition, and artificial intelligence, have been on the rise in Africa. Almost every capital you go to, you can't miss it. But how they are procured, how they are used, and the safety of information that is collected, the transparency around these issues is not known. Now, the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, has ranked procurement of communication and technology systems as one of the top 4 most challenged when it comes to corruption. Others being public infrastructure projects, transportation and storage, and extractive industries. Concerns have also been raised regarding the use of surveillance of DTS, digital technology systems, for surveillance of legitimate political opposition, civil society organizations, journalists, and ordinary citizens who just want, to be governed well. And that causes an invitation for surveillance. Also, questions have been raised regarding regulation and access to use of personal information that is collected in key areas such as advertising for commercial purposes or for political competition. Obviously, without the knowledge and approval of data subjects. With support from the Media Network, the Africa Freedom of Information Center, together with the PPDC and Center for Media Studies and Peace Building, both of whom are represented in this panel, we conducted a research in Uganda, Liberia, and Nigeria. The main questions or objectives we wanted to address was the transparency of the procurement and use of digital technology platforms in these countries, and also issues around regulation and safeguards regarding data that is collected. We used different approaches to collect data, including surveys, and indeed, we survey captured, involved 1,368 persons from rural and urban areas, including women, men, and youth. We conducted key informant interviews in each of the 3 countries, and these involved public officials responsible for procurement, responsible for security, immigration, and also interviewed election management bodies and national human rights institutions. Altogether, although it was challenging getting appointments, we interviewed 29 agencies. We also filed information requests. Each of these countries have national access to information laws, so we used this approach to complement data gathering. We filed information requests on agencies that had procured digital technology systems, and mainly we are requesting for procurement plans, for tender information, for copies of contracts, payment information, and guidelines on how to use data that has been collected. And finally, we also had review of secondary sources. Different documents were reviewed to support this study. In terms of findings, we found that whereas people were generally aware of the existence of digital technology systems in these countries, they did not know how they were procured, used, or regulated. And you remember that one of the issues is that procurement of these systems is among the top 4 where corruption is most common. We also found that there was secrecy in the procurement of these systems, with very little proactive disclosure, but also response to information requests. In terms of information requests, in Uganda, we filed 20 information requests. We filed a request to 20 agencies, and only 1 was responded to. We got information from only 1. In Nigeria, we filed information requests to 11 agencies. 3 responded with a refusal. The rest kept quiet, which we term as mute refusal. In Liberia, all the information that was requested were only given verbally. They could not confidently give the document so that our research team are able to independently examine and make conclusions from those documents. And then finally, we found that there was lack of transparency on safeguarding against abuse of personal information that is collected through these systems. We make recommendations on 3 cluster areas. The first one is that civil society campaigns to promote transparency of procurement and use of digital technology systems should be implemented across the continent. Second, we recognize that responsiveness of public agencies is dependent on the demand that they get from citizens. And yet, we found that the demand was very low. So we recommend that campaigns for access to information, targeting journalists, targeting civil society organizations, and citizens be implemented in the 3 countries, but also across the continent. And finally, we also recommend that regulators need to be transparent and accountable. In this regard, they should make and publish annual reports regarding annual transparency reports in the context of safeguards, in the context of digital technology platforms. Thank you for your kind attention.
Gilbert, thank you very much for that very detailed summary. And clearly, from the findings that came from the study, there are some issues that we do need to address. And I'd like to build on some of those findings as I pose the next question. But I also wanted to just bring to the audience's attention that many of the issues that you've touched upon, the issues particularly of concern that you've touched upon that came up from the study, are they are corresponding with what the audience feels. So for example, the first question that we asked on the session poll, does the procurement and deployment of digital technology systems in Africa reflect principles of transparency and accountability? The majority of respondents strongly disagree. And then a fair number of respondents do not know or are not aware on whether the procurement and deployment of digital technology systems in Africa reflects on principles of transparency and accountability. And then a very small minority would strongly agree, and an even smaller minority would agree. So that is very consistent with the findings of the study, that the majority of the audience would strongly disagree that the procurement of digital technology systems reflect principles of transparency and accountability. And that then allows me to shift gears a bit. And Kem, I'll bring you into the discussion. And just wanted to find out from you and from your experience and from some of the work that you've been doing in Nigeria. Public procurement in Africa is characterized by secrecy, inefficiency, in some cases corruption, and even abuse. From the study and knowledge of practices in Nigeria and in other countries, what are the experiences? Is the risk low or high when it comes to the procurement of digital technology platforms? What are some of the issues and also some of the concerns? And feel free to draw upon some of the experiences you may have in Nigeria, or of course, even other countries across the continent. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Robert. And that's a very interesting question. Procurement is, I think it's public knowledge that procurement is the pathway to service delivery, but also the highest corruption risk when you look at it from that angle. And when you speak about digital technology systems, whether the risk is high or low, I would say that I have a 2-part answer to that particular question. The first is that in the 3 countries that you look at, from Liberia, Uganda, and Nigeria, we all 3 have public procurement laws. And all 3 have procurement laws that apply to, the scope of application covers every form of procurement that come out of each of these countries. And there are very clear guidelines of how procurement should go. Now, that is in theory, but how this is practiced is a different conversation. Why I say how this is practiced is a different conversation is the results, the survey results show that a huge number of Liberians, Nigerians, and Ugandans also believe that governments do not adhere to the procurement process, the existing laws on public procurement, and that more importantly, they are not aware of how the procurement laws application in itself. So you have a case of information or knowledge gap. You have a case of compliance issues, irrespective of whether the laws exist, whether the safeguards are already in the law. The second part of that question also comes to what kinds of digital technology that is being procured. So for Nigeria, we procured the National Identity Management Commission, that's the NIMC, procures digital software for biometrics, for issuance of the national ID card. The same thing with the Liberian situation where they're procuring technology for national identity registration, and Uganda, biometric facial software recognition. And all of these different procurements are supposed to go through the procurement process. But when you look at the 3 acts, you will see that there is special qualification or exception where the procurement comes to national security or anything designated as national security. If you look at it, national security is not defined in a holistic manner that you say, how does it apply? So take, for instance, Nigeria. The Public Procurement Act specifically exempts procurements that are related to national security without the express approval of the president. Liberia goes to say that procurement of by national security agencies are not exempted, but when it comes to national security equipment and military equipment, they're exempted, and there are other conditions that are listed in the act of how they would apply. So that immediately throws up questions of how are these procurements made? Because if you look at all 3 procurement processes outlined in the 3 acts, the act calls for open procurement processes, and where there are conditions that allow for it, restricted processes. But that means that information with regards to the tendering process will not be in the public the moment you go into the restricted processes. And that also further means that people are not able to interface with that information. And that is a huge part of what happens when it comes to defense procurement, defense designated national security procurement, and surveillance equipment. So for example, in Nigeria in 2013, there was a leaked report about Nigerian government acquiring a surveillance software from the Israelis for the purpose of surveilling people's communications and through the mobile networks. And that procurement did not pass through the public procurement process. There was a huge outcry about that. You also have the survey also showed the absence of lack of technical expertise that within the MDAs. So a lot of conflicting reports from the MDAs. The report says, and when I say the MDAs, I mean in the ministry, departments, and agencies. Some of the respondents from the government angle felt that the public procurement process was exhaustive enough and we are aware they had technical competence. Some of the others also responded that there was an absence of technical competence when it came to security matters. And so they had to include a lot of security experts, or they would purchase and find that the equipment they have purchased is redundant and or not fit for purpose. And that complicates the process when it comes to finances and use of that procurement and that equipment. Another challenge that would also notice when it comes to public procurement in Nigeria and across these 3 different countries is political influence. The Public Procurement Act ordinarily would divorce political influence by setting up tender boards, by setting up the National Council on Public Procurement that should make rules and regulations that guide the public procurement process in the Nigerian scenario. But all 3 countries had tenders board, and they had technical expertise committees, different committees for different purposes. But the political influence from the political office holders and their interest is not, you can't divorce it from how the procurement goes, especially when it comes into matters of interest, such as biometric captures and surveillance tools by security sector agencies. One other issue that we also found in the public procurement process was public distrust for how the public procurement methods and the purpose of the procurement happens. And when you have citizens' distrust in the procurement process, the existence of the procurement laws no longer make a difference. It means that for every procurement that NIMC carries out, the national and the Departments for Security Service carries out, the police or the army carries out, people automatically assume that that procurement is for surveillance purpose, that procurement is to monitor and spy into the networks. And a huge part of that comes from the absence of public information in the public domain. And why this is important is it connects back to the exemption clause in the Public Procurement Acts of all of these countries. how do you ensure that people are aware of the procurement methods? How do you ensure that people are aware of the procurement? Is putting information in the public domain. How do you ensure that public domain information is available to people? Is making sure that the regulatory framework or the legal documents permits that process. And that is where the gap is for me. And back to the question on, is the risk high or is the risk low? The risk is significantly high, and experience from each of these countries show that surveillance is the major tool or equipments that are being procured when digital and technology systems are being procured by government agencies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kim. And I believe you've also answered a lot of the questions that myself and other members of the audience may have in terms of the use of these digital technologies for surveillance purposes, and it's happening across the continent. We've seen it happen in many countries, and again, the fact that procurement is also of these systems is also shielded behind national security laws or issues. But we have seen cases. I remember a few years ago in Kenya, procurement of aircraft for the Air Force, which was supposed to meet, a certain criteria. It was done, behind closed doors. It was a closed procurement. Everybody understood this. But when the aircraft landed and the Air Force technical team had to test and use this aircraft, it was quite outdated, and a lot of issues came up in terms of even procurement of spare parts and maintenance and just the cost of maintenance. And that could have been avoided if the procurement had been a bit more transparent, have been a bit more open, and the users themselves were actually involved in putting together the specifications, right? Because at the end of the day, they're the ones who are going to determine whether the item can work or it cannot work. So we have seen those challenges come up, and hopefully, over time, we'll be able to apply more pressure, both from civil society and other players, for government to be a bit more open and on this public procurement of digital technology systems. Thank you. Ruth, I'd like to bring you to the conversation and look at issues around data and data privacy. And we know, from the report and from the study, that technology has enabled a collection of large volumes of personal data, regardless of which country we are speaking about. And this data is data on citizens. Studies and other sources have also revealed that quite often stakeholders use the data collected from these digital technology systems beyond the immediate needs for which it is collected. In some cases, it has been revealed that this data has been sold for marketing purposes, influencing elections, and also for criminal activity. From the research, are these concerns material, as far as you can tell? And what do you think about the regulatory framework and transparency around protection of personal information and citizens' data when this information is being collected? Welcome, Ruth.
Thank you, Robert. Okay, so during the study, it was noted that there are no separate laws or regulations that govern the procurement and use of digital technology system. Well, while Liberia is still discussing the passage of a cyber crimes law to address the chronic abuse of digital technologies, especially internet crimes, there's a little effort being put into the crafting of policies or laws that aim to govern procurement and the use of digital technology. So as it stands, even though there are not standalone laws that govern procurement in Liberia as a case, it is generally agreed that public procurement and Concession Act that governs all purchases of procurement-related items, regardless of what is being bought. So the PPCA, that is a Public Procurement and Concession Act, governs all purchases, regardless of what is being bought. So like it's everything has been combined. And this act that was passed in 2005, it was part of the government reform process that allows Liberia to be on par. So amended in 2010, the PPCA has been operating in Liberia since then. So now what we have over here is the Public Procurement and Concession Commission of Liberia. So they ensure that procurement of goods and services by government institutions follow the rules that spell out in the Act and regulation. Even though this Act does not exclusively address the issue of digital technology, several provisions of it, if it has been passed, even though there are discussions around this cybercrime law or cybercrime bill that has been submitted to the office of the president, there are several other things that this act will address. For example, in section 3 of the proposed act, gives the president the power to designate certain computer networks as critical national infrastructure. And someone convicted of damaging such infrastructure shall have a prison term of 3 to 5 years. And this proposed law as well also imposes prison term for anyone who unlawfully intercepts communications. So also as reflected as well in the proposed act in in section 7, it has to do with unauthorized, modifies computer data. So these are several other provisions that are captured as well, as we are collectively working to ensuring that the drafted act or bill that we currently have will be sent over to the national legislature, thus ensuring that we have a law that governs cyber crimes in Liberia. As it stands, there is no law in Liberia that governs cybercrime, even though there have been a policy that have been drafted, but advocacies are currently ongoing to ensuring that we have a cybercrime law in Liberia. So looking at the perspective of key stakeholders of procurement and the deployment of digital technology system, well, several key stakeholder interviews were conducted as part of this study. And these interviews cut across government institutions that either serve as policy role in the use of technology or end user themselves. So from these interviews, certain conclusions were drawn on the acquisition and the use of digital technology system in Liberia. And some of these include the deployment of digital technology systems is rare within Liberia, and the use of DTS exists in very few government and private institutions, and there is no policy on the importation of digital technology systems across institutions in Liberia. Absolutely, the study found that we don't have any system or any policy of such when it comes to the deployment of DTS across institutions in Liberia. And the DTS in most used in the country are biometric readers and closed circuit television equipment that we have. And biometric readers are largely deployed as human resource monitoring mechanism by some government and private offices. So biometric readers are also deployed in some institutions as a security measure to control access to public buildings or parts of buildings. And they are also used by government agencies like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Liberian Immigration Service to respectively issue passports like the ECOWAS passport, the Economic Community of West African State ECOWAS. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs uses that to issue passports and record the entry and exit of travelers from the country. And this was fully captured under the Liberian Immigration Service. And the government has embarked on a national identification scheme, which issues biometric identification cards to Liberian citizens. And the study also finds that the government's primary use of DTS is with the view of moving the country into digital economy. And this is clearly in response to the cash problems related to the limited supply of banknotes within Liberia. So there are no separate procurement rules for digital technology systems, and the general procurement rules that apply to other government acquisition applies to DTS. So like we all capture under one rule. So the rules are not separate. And the study also finds that the government agencies responsible for the deployment of these, they intend as well to ensuring that agencies that are captured under government deploy DTS soon. So when it comes to citizens' privacy on the use of DTS, so as stated, no specific law in Liberia that govern the issue of privacy when it comes to the use of DTS. Even though this is the case, but Liberia, the current penal law of Liberia seems to address unwarranted intrusion as captured in the Liberian Constitution, Chapter 19. And the law makes it this demeanor of the first degree of anyone to engage in unlawful surveillance and of a private property or in a space where someone may reasonably expect to have privacy by using any device or observing, photographing, recording, amplifying, or broadcasting sounds or events in such place. So the provision is quite wide-ranging and could apply to data captured by the use of DTS, even though criminal lawyers may argue that their law was passed in 1976 and the frameworks could not have intended to cover modern technologies as we are currently experiencing within this age. So in terms of transparency in government procurement of DTS, um, more than half of the respondents that we spoke to in the survey did not agree that bidders have equal chances in the procurement process. Again, 63% of the respondents did not also agree that competing firms are given chances to participate in the procurement of DTS. However, only 17% of the respondents seem to think that the different bidders are always given equal chances during the procurement process. Well, more respondents do not believe that there is transparency when the government procures digital technologies. Only 16 of the overall 400 respondents agree with the statement, and only 6 of these respondents also thought that the local companies should not be given chance to supply digital technology within the country. Thank you.
Ruth, thank you very much for that detailed response. And you know, your response actually aligns with some of the responses that we're seeing on the session poll. I just wanted to just touch base on the second poll that we had, or the second question that we had in the poll, which was a statement that said the collection, management, and use of personal information collected using digital technology systems in Africa is properly regulated and free of abuse risk. And the majority of the respondents have stated that this statement is false. And about 3 individuals have said that they do not know, and only 1 said that the statement is true. So the majority of respondents do agree that the collection, management, and use of personal information collected using digital technology systems in Africa is not properly regulated and free of abuse and risk. So the statement in the poll was false. So thank you very much for responding to that. Gilbert, I wanted to bring you in just with a couple of questions that that you can respond to, and I just, from AFIC's perspective, I just wanted to ask, what role do you see civil society playing in getting information about the digital technology systems across that are procured by governments across different ministries, departments, and agencies? What tactics, what strategies can civil society use to be able to get information? Because we know for a fact that many governments are not sharing this information. Many of them are not willing to publicize this information. Procurement of DTS is usually done behind closed doors. So what are some of the strategies from your perspective that you can guide civil society across the continent in terms of being able to collect this information? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Robert. Yeah, when we talk about secrecy behind procurements or public information, we're actually talking about huge public interest. I'll give an example. In one of the 3 countries we studied, the government spent 62 million euros to procure biometric equipment to to issue voters' cards, national IDs rather. But for that money, and this company had been procured, through direct procurement, nobody knew them, nobody knew what their quotation was. But for 62 million euros, they only issued 14,000 IDs, 14,000. You'll see in the study where Nigeria, for slightly almost the same amount, they were able to register nearly over 100 million people and issue them with cards. So the reason why disclosure does not take place or lack of access to information is because there is something. So in view of that, what should civil society do? We have seen across the continent, whether it is in respect of passage of access to information laws or their implementation, the role of civil society is very critical. So under these laws, and these countries have respective freedom of information legislations, they can file information requests. When refusal has happened, as has happened in the case of this study, there are mechanisms. The laws provide for appeals. In the case of Liberia, to the Information Commissioner, and ultimately to the court. And in the case of Uganda and Nigeria, to courts. Now, once court issue orders, then the agencies are compelled to act on them. Also, like I said, secrecy is because they are protecting something that has gone right, which means that, for example, in the case of the 62 million euros, this could help to provide medicine to millions of people. So therefore, civil society can take also a dimension, a tactic of building political pressure to explain to the public why it is important for public business to be open and transparent, and invite members of the public, to mount that pressure so that the agencies and officials who are required to disclose information do so. And this is very important because when decision makers know that the decisions they are making are going to be public, they are going to be known at some point, they are going to behave differently. But because there has been lack of awareness of the risks associated with procurements, but also use of personal information collected through DTS, there has been this kind of impunity that, we can do everything in the dark and nobody shall ever know. Also, a risk of selling this information for commercial purposes. In any of these countries, you are there, you get a promotional message on SMS, telling you about something that, you have an interest about. So civil society can play this role, but also understand that whereas there are many civil society organizations and media organizations, many of them require some form of capacity to understand what are the issues, what are the concerns, what is the public interest, and then how does that link to their work and how they can actually use access to information to promote transparency in the sphere of their work. Also, we know in many countries in Africa, the issue of independence of regulators and oversight agencies is a challenge. So what civil society can do in this case is to use regional and international mechanisms, such as the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, to invite or make complaints so that these agencies can also intervene on behalf of the people so that transparency can be advanced. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gilbert, for sharing those nuggets of information. And you're right, I think civil society, of course, does have to employ different tactics, different strategies to be able to get this information. Otherwise, if civil society does not do that, then procurement of DTSs will continue behind closed doors for a long period of time. And in many cases, it may even be at the detriment of citizens. So we depend and rely on civil society to be able to ask the difficult questions. And I perhaps just wanted to have a follow-on question for you, Gilbert, on that, in terms of, in many of the countries across the continent, there is a need to build the capacity of civil society organizations to be able to ask the right questions and demand for accountability. Because it's one thing to want to demand accountability, but it's another thing to be able to ask the right questions. Could you maybe in a couple of minutes just give a brief overview of how do we go about building the capacity of those civil society organizations so that they're asking governments or multilaterals the right questions when it comes to the procurement of digital technology systems? Gilbert, you're on mute. Gilbert. Sorry, you're on mute. We can't hear you. Yeah, go ahead.
So, is it better now? Okay, yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
So
go ahead.
I was saying that, civil society organizations, many of them depend on donor funds, implement specific activities. And one of the key strategies for capacity strengthening is to be able to align, access to information as a tool to advance the causes, missions, and goals of those civil society organizations. For example, an organization working on women's rights or women's issues, being able to understand that access to information can be an important tool to advance women's cause would be very, very important. And therefore, different approaches can be used on raising awareness, but also capacities of these organizations. For example, here at AFIC, we have developed training manuals for civil society on access to information for public officials and for journalists. So it is a ready-made tool that can be used to train these groups. What is key is to align it to the different stakeholder groups. Secondly, understanding that refusal is not an end. There are many agencies, people can go to court, but what do you need to go to court to make a successful appeal? What do you need to go, for example, to the African Commission to make a successful appeal? So being able to help them frame the right issues and also accompany them in being able to strengthen that. And one of the key things that we emphasize here is a hands-on approach, mentorship. If we are saying we are training people on how to litigate on freedom of information, we test out cases, support them to make information requests, and then we walk all the way through to litigation so that at the end of the day, they are able to have their capacity strengthened. Thank you.
Gilbert, thank you very much for that. And Nkem, I just wanted to bring you back into the conversation around reforms and encouraging governments across the continent to establish reforms. And my question to you is, what reforms can be established to facilitate some form of transparency and accountability? And in your view, do you think governments are willing to support the process? And do you have some examples perhaps that you could share with us? So what reforms can be established to facilitate transparency and accountability? And are African governments willing to support the process of reforms? Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Yes, I think that reforms are a key part of any work we do around transparency and accountability, especially as it relates to the public procurement, whether of digital technology systems or any form of procurement at all. And a big part of that reform would also come from our national laws, right? Our national laws guide how procurements happen. It's the ground norm of the work that happens in the procurement process, whether from the development of the procurement plans down to the actual procurement and down to the contract implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. And surprisingly, a lot of these laws are old, they are archaic, they haven't taken into cognizance that there are new laws on freedom of information, on cyber security, on digital technology, the role of BVN and in biometrics, facial recognition, and all of these different technologies. And that needs to happen at some point. And we need to also, the reforms also need to take into cognizance that national security, conversations of national security needs to constantly be expanded. There needs to be a conversation on accountability on the part of security agencies and non-security agencies that hide under the cover of national security in procuring some of these digital technologies. And another key part of that reform needs to happen on how we publish information on contracting. Digital penetration across Africa is on the rise. A lot of people are on different forms of technology, and government is using technology. Governments across Africa are using technology to reach out to people, keep people abreast of the information and the procurements, how they go about service delivery. I would also think that there needs to be some thought to how open disclosure when it comes to public procurement. So take, for instance, the work on open contracting and open contracting data standards, the standards that connect how the budget down to contract implementation, and making sure that information is published in a way that people are able to track, people are able to use, researchers and journalists, even governments are able to plan better when information is published in a single standardized format across the different government agencies within each of this country, in each of these countries. And I think this is an important aspect of the work that government needs to do when it comes to reforms. So Nigeria and Uganda have started this process, and it's still ongoing. It's still developing despite the number of years that it has been on. But it's important that we need to speed up the process. So take, for instance, if you look at the report on the report on the survey that has happened across the 3 countries, one of the issues highlighted was that when you look at the budget or planning documents, the information there is not clear. Then when you start tracking through the procurement process, you're unable to find that kind of procurement. And once you have contract disclosure, transparency in a standardized format, different sectors of government, different sectors of society are able to track the information reports. There is that fear that the more disclosure we have, the more people will hold us accountable, and we are worried about citizens attacking government. But there needs to also be the understanding or the balance that citizens are a useful source when it comes to information. Government can be everywhere. Citizens are the big brother for government. They are able to provide feedback and information when it comes to contracts that are being implemented within their communities, within their societies, within their local governments, because of the reach that citizens have. So that's one of the reforms I think government needs to take into account. Updating the laws to reflect new and transparent mechanisms, and putting more standards and more thought into standards on open contracting and publishing information. Thank you.
Kim, thank you so much for that wonderful response. And as we approach the end of our session, I'd like to perhaps ask my panelists if they could share a parting shot, just 1 minute each, before we wrap up. We have three or so minutes before we close. So Ruth, I'll start with you. Your parting shot. 60 seconds counting.
Thank you. So recently we have launched the Freedom of Information Fellowship for Liberian journalists who will be more involved into investigative journalism. And so the issue of procurement and the open bidding and everything. So these are some of the issues as well that some of our fellows, 25 of them, will be writing on other national issues. So as captured in the report, in terms of recommendation, and I believe that we should be unique to countries that I mentioned in the process, there is a need to have more publicity around procurement laws and policies. And I think it would be good for the citizen. And to quickly conclude, I think that the government, both, let's say the 3 governments in this country should be able to communicate procurement policies and actions more to the public with the view of improving public trust in its activities. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Ruth. Gilbert, your parting shot, 1 minute, starting now.
Yes, thank you very much. What we learn is that the responsiveness to transparency demands is by governments is dependent on the demands citizens make. And yet, from this study, we find that specifically when it comes to demands for transparency and accountability in respect to DTS, the demand is very low. Demand around, transparency on regulation does not exist. So our call, therefore, is for civil society and all stakeholders to support work for transparency in this space. Thank you very much.
Gilbert, thank you very much. Kim, your parting shot.
My parting shot would be that as the civic space is currently shutting down, closing, it's on us as civil society to continue to tackle issues of transparency and accountability and keep putting our best foot forward in a way that Africa will become the continent we expect it to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kim, and I'm deeply grateful to my panelists, Kim Ilo, Ruth Bato, and Gilbert Sendogwa, for such an engaging and informative session, and also to the session organizers. Thank you very much for your patience, the audience for being with us and for listening in, and also participation in both the Q&A and also the session poll. We're now at time, and so I would like to thank my panelists, thank the audience, thank the the organizers for joining us in this wonderful session. And just to wish everybody a good day, the rest of a good afternoon, good morning, wherever you may be. Thank you very much.